Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Vazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. You guys, I have someone who is a revolutionary. She is trying to create a sperm revolution. Not trying to create, it's already happened. And she's trying to bring attention to something that we should all know about. Dr. Shanna Swan, welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show.
Thanks for inviting me, Amy. I'm really pleased to be here and to tell you about my book, Countdown.
I can't wait to hear more about it. So you guys, Dr. Swan has a PhD and she's one of the world's leading environmental and reproductive epidemiologists and professor of environmental medicine and public health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. She is an award-winning scientist. Her work examines the impact on environmental exposures, including chemicals such as phthalates and BPA, on men and women's reproductive health and the neurodevelopment of children. She is the author of Countdown: How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, Altering Male and Female Reproductive Development, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. And I just have to throw in #CountMeIn because it's so important for us to talk about this and bring attention to something that is so important to the future of our families. So it is such an honor to have you here today. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got interested in studying fertility and environmental issues, and show us a copy of your book?
Sure. Happy to show the book. Beautiful cover, great publisher, Scribner, Simon & Schuster. So how I got into this, I got interested in sperm decline in the late 1990s, and I was part of a committee, a national committee, National Academy of Sciences, and they wanted to know whether a paper that had come out then in 1992 was something they should worry about when they talked about risks of environmental chemicals and hormone disrupting chemicals. And so this paper actually claimed that sperm count had been, there'd been a significant decline in sperm count, and it didn't convince me, I have to say. I was a skeptic originally. That's my nature. That's what I do. And so I had some time, and so I said I will try to understand whether this decline that they reported could be due to other things, right? And we're all familiar with that. Maybe the way sperm was counted changed over time in a way that later counts were lower. That could happen. Maybe the men who came in later, more in recent years, were selected in some way to have lower sperm counts, right? Maybe they were more obese. Maybe they smoked more. Maybe this, right? So I took 6 months actually to answer this question. And I involved two colleagues, and together we went through 61 studies that had gone into this analysis and looked for all those things. And then we put them in a big model and analyzed the data. And the decline did not change at all, not to the first decimal place. So I began to think, well, wow, there's something going on here. And I spent the next 20 years trying to figure this out. And the more I studied it, the more convinced I was, A, that it was real, B, that it was not going away, and C, that it was related to our environment. And that's a large part of what Countdown is about.
Yeah, and I watched one of your really incredible talks that you gave on YouTube last night, and you just frame it in such a way that's really eye-opening. And I think one of the things that you were talking about was like, imagine being part of an experiment where you're being poisoned your entire life from, the time you're basically in your mother's uterus. And then you're like, but it's not an experiment, And that's just like, holy smokes! When you frame it like that, it's very compelling. So let's jump to the chase. Sperm counts, testosterone, and male fertility rates are dropping. What has the decline truly been over the past 40, 50 years?
So the rates of these declines in fertility, and by the way, fertility is, as you very well know, a couple phenomena. So I prefer to say couple fertility has declined at 1% per year everywhere, which is so shocking. Testosterone has declined at 1% per year. Sperm count, sperm concentration, and problems have been going up. Miscarriage, increasing 1% per year. Delayed ovarian reserve has been decreasing. And so there's something going on that's tying these things together in men and women, and by the way, in non-human species as well. And while there are a lot of things we do in our daily life that affect our fertility, as you well know, there are things that we have very little control over. The things that are, if you will, administered to us as subjects in a huge experiment that we're part of without our consent, right? And we can talk about those in more detail.
Yeah. And some people have called this phenomenon Spermageddon, and it seems appropriate and sort of terrifying at the same time. So what is exactly happening to the sperm?
Oh, Amy, there's so much happening to sperm that is concerning. I'm sure to you too, as a physician in this area. So I would say the easy end of this is what happens to an adult male. And that's easy because he can change things that are adversely affecting his sperm, and he should. And I'm sure you give this kind of advice, but smoking, binge drinking, stress, good luck with that in these days, but stress, obesity, lack of exercise, even heat are things that, as you know, can affect a man's sperm count. But you also know that if he changes his behavior, he can improve his sperm count. And there are many examples of that, of guys who couldn't get it together, couldn't do it, and change their behavior, and then they could. So that's a good news story. The bad news story is that there are other changes that occur that nobody can do anything about. And those are changes that happened a long time ago, that is, in the womb. And those are changes that followed the exposure of the mother when she was pregnant, or even the father around the time that he was, if you will, preparing the sperm that was going to make that fertilized egg. So those 60 to 70 days during which sperm is being produced are very sensitive to exposures, which will then impact the developing fetus. Those changes, which we can talk about what happens, are not reversible. Those are lifetime changes. And some of them get passed on to future generations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have this dream, and I hope one day it'll be realized, where somehow 3 months before, you're planning a pregnancy, you get these like pre-pregnancy kits. It's like guidance for what to eat, how to live. So I think it would just be incredible before people even start trying to conceive. You get some sort of pre-pregnancy kit that's delivered to you, and then even throughout the pregnancy, pregnancy safe, containers to eat out of, cosmetics, just hints and tips that people just don't know about, don't you think?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Bearing in mind that their actual conception might be many months after, later than they thought it would be. So they might have to do this for quite a while, which is a good thing, yes.
Yeah, maybe countdown could also be, you go to a little link on your website, and then you can also, subscribe to some sort of pregnancy kit. Anyways, one day, we can only dream. But you were mentioning about some of the things that happen downstream, I think. What are those things?
I've studied a specific class of chemicals, right? And the chemicals that I study are those that have the ability to interfere with our body's hormones. So, as you know, your hormone health is extremely critical to this whole process of conception and pregnancy. And birth. And all along the way, we need the right hormones at the right time to do this complicated job, which is taking place unseen from conception to birth. So that is the most sensitive period in an individual's life, those 9 months, and particularly the first 3 months. So when I got involved in this, which happened, by the way, when a friend was on the plane with me, and he said, "Shanna, you should study phthalates." And I said, "What are phthalates?" As many people do. And he told me, and he said that these are chemicals in our daily life, and the Centers for Disease Control has shown that everybody in the United States has these in their body, including pregnant women. So that's one fact. The second fact was that around that time, toxicologists at the National Toxicology Program had been doing experiments to see what these chemicals did to rodents that were exposed. And what they found was so startling that they called it the phthalate syndrome. And there's not too many chemical exposures that have a syndrome named after them. I think alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol. But usually they're not that consistent and predictable. But they showed that when the mother rat was exposed to phthalates at a critical time, which we can talk about early in pregnancy, then it affected the boys, not the girls. But the boys were born with their genitals not quite as they should be. They were not completely masculinized. And that happens because several phthalates have the ability to interfere with testosterone. They actually lower the body's production of testosterone. And why is that important? It's important because when the genital tract is differentiating, going in the male or the female direction, depending on your genetic sex, that process in males requires testosterone. It requires enough testosterone at the right time. If it's not there, then the male doesn't complete that journey, and then he's not completely masculinized. No man wants to hear that, right? And so we can talk about the next steps, but I basically got very interested, and I wanted to see whether that was happening in humans. And long story short, after 20 years, I am of doing 2 very large and very expensive studies where we actually saw how mothers' phthalates were related to boys' genital development. I concluded that the phthalate syndrome exists in humans.
And how small of a change are we really looking at when a female rodent is pregnant?
So the exposure levels that were associated with these changes were low, and they were not extremely low. They were the levels that 25% of the US population is exposed to. So they're not rare occurrences. The changes that they caused were also not very dramatic on an individual level. So if you look at these boys, you won't think, oh my gosh, the poor kid. Not at all. We're talking about millimeters of differences. But just like lowering lead or raising lead changes IQ, that's a different story, but that's just an example of another low dose that makes a big effect for a whole population, right? So we're talking about changes on the population level. And it turns out, and we can get to that story in a minute, that those changes in the genitals actually translate to clinical changes and lifetime fertility and health.
What can people do to make a difference for themselves and their own fertility? I'd love for you to address it both from an individual standpoint and at a societal level.
Very hard question for 2 reasons. The personal changes, the ones that you're going to make to minimize your exposure to these phthalates or other chemicals that can change your hormones, those changes are difficult because a lot of our products aren't labeled. We don't see cans of spaghetti sauce labeled contains DEHP, DBP. No, not at all, right? And so we don't have the option to buy something different that's unexposed because there's no labeling. There's some examples, but they're misleading. Like Bisphenol A is another chemical that changes hormones. It actually makes plastic hard, where phthalates make plastic soft. And many people look for that BPA-free label, right? But what they don't know is, yes, it can be free of BPA, and no, it may be not safe if it contains look-alike chemicals such as BPF, as in Frank, or BPS, as in Sam, that don't have the same name, so they can honestly say BPA-free, but these alternatives, lookalikes, have the same risk. So what is a consumer to do? They get the advice from you and other people saying, avoid these exposures. They try, they go to the store, they look for these products, and they can't really make an informed decision. So I think we really have to change the way these chemicals are handled. And actually, I think we have to go a step back and keep them out of commerce altogether. We should not be exposed continually to hundreds of chemicals that can alter our hormone systems, which we are. And by the way, it's not just about fertility. It's also about brain development. It's also about thyroid function. It's also very relevant these days about the immune system. And we're weakened, if you will, by the presence of these chemicals in our lives. So what has to happen? The chemicals have to be swapped out for those that don't have these properties, and the government has to regulate them in a way that protects us, which they actually do not.
And I know that there's another publication that stated that this is kind of where global warming was 40 years ago. What do we need to do to turn the tide on this?
So the reason I think we're where we were 40 years ago is that if you go back and think about climate change, initially people didn't believe it. And then they believed it when they saw the evidence, but they said that's not human doing. That's just happening. And now people are recognizing that we can make changes in our lives that can help. I think the same process is going on, but we're late here with the reproductive health. So initially in 1992, when that paper came out saying sperm count had declined, it was denied, even by me. And then as people got wiser, they began to realize, yes, it actually has declined, and that decline is not slowing down. But they said, it's just happening. It's not about human choice or endocrine disruption. And now they're starting to accept that these chemicals can play a role and cause this decline. So I think what we have to do is pretty quickly make changes to the chemicals that are in our lives and the regulations of these chemicals in order to slow the decline. It is continuing. So when we looked at the last 40 years, then 30 years, then 20 years, you would hope to see it flattening out, but we didn't see that. So unless we do something to stop our exposure to these chemicals, it's just going to hit zero.
And then what can you give us some of your predictions based on your research as far as like when that could be?
That's a difficult thing because, you know, I'm a statistician. I don't like to extrapolate past my data. I could say hypothetically, yes, you can extend the line. Whether that is reasonable, whether we'll make changes, I certainly hope is not what's going to happen. But if everything continued along that same path, by 2045, that line would hit zero. Now that's median. That's half less and half more, and sperm count can't be negative. So half the population would have a sperm count above zero, but it would be low. And we would be dependent on artificial or assisted reproduction to conceive.
That's actually a prediction that I've made as well, not as far as the date, but I predict that very soon, probably in the next generation, we're going to be doing sperm aspirations at the same time as egg retrievals to create embryos, and that's going to be the new normal. So you're going to have a urologist doing his part, the fertility doctor, the IVF specialist doing the egg part for people to continue to procreate.
It's scary, isn't it?
It is, and I don't want it to come to that. So, that's why when I read about your book, and clearly I'm wearing a dress that matches your book cover, all on purpose, um, I was very excited to have you come on here because I feel like the more people we can reach, the more of a difference we can make. And so that's why your message and your book and your research are so important to our existence. So what do you think fertility doctors need to know about this situation? What would be the most important thing for them to take away from your book and your research?
I think fertility doctors, first of all, should recommend that all men understand their own fertility and not wait till there's trouble to get a sperm count, because we haven't talked about this, but I'm sure you know that men who have a low sperm count have higher morbidity in many areas and earlier mortality. So it's an important sign, the sixth vital sign, if you will, that men should be aware of. Okay, men don't like this. They just say, I'm good to go, I have no problems. Well, how do they know that until it's put to the test? So, and I think that the medical community should become more educated on this issue, that they understand what's going on. It's not very well known, as you know, and I think that's a real problem. I think back in medical school, there should be courses on this. There should be questions on the exams on the role of environment in fertility and reproductive health. And I think they should have that kit that you talked about where you can advise on specific, eat unprocessed foods, try to eat organic if you can afford it. Watch the products that you rub on your skin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you read Countdown, we have lots of recommendations on what to do.
I love it. Yeah, I'm going to be recommending Countdown now to all my patients. There's no doubt about it. And the thing is, I think there's so much, I call it sugar coating of sperm, where people get a sperm analysis and their abnormalities, but it's just fine, rather than saying, well, these are the recommendations that I have for you to make it even better. Fine just isn't going to be enough, I think, for a lot of people. If someone wants to find out more about your work and your book, where can they go?
So they can go to my website, which is just simply shannaswan.com. They can put into one of their favorite booksellers, Countdown, Shanna Swan, and they'll see that. And if they do that and they have the opportunity of writing a review, if they like the book, or even if they don't, I'd love to hear their opinions about the book. And then I'd love people to use #CountMeIn if they want to be part of this growing concern and movement, which is trying to fix this problem.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us today?
I want to thank you for your interest in this and for your helping of so many patients and reaching out and educating people. It's so sorely lacking in the profession, and I'm glad you're here, Amy.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Abazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.